أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء وخاتم المرسلين سيدنا ونبينا بالقاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين واللعنة الدائمة الباقية إلى أعدائهم من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. Amma ba'd, brothers and sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum. We've been blessed with the month of Ramadan, the month where we get the opportunity to return back to the Qur'an, to study the Qur'an. And the surah that we have been briefly reviewing during these few nights has been Surah Jathiya, surah number 45 of the Qur'an. The ayat that we discussed prior to the ayats for tonight, these are the ayat where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had talked about the message and the reaction to the message. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not only revealed the Quran, He showed the signs of His existence, His presence, and His power and glory. But there were two kinds of reactions. One was those who believed, and on the other hand, you had people who did not accept it, ignored it, and ridiculed the message. And yesterday we looked at the ayat where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He's not going to treat the two different groups in the same way. He says they cannot be equal in the eyes of Allah. And He connected that with the ayat we concluded yesterday, the discussion about the purpose of life and the day of Qiyamah. He says, I've created the heavens and the earth for you, and then there is a day where I'm going to recompense you for your deeds. For good deeds, it is reward. For misdeeds, there is punishment. And so the whole issue of Qiyamah and the day of judgment was connected to the issue that people, whatever they do here, Allah is not going to look at them in the same way. Those who are good doers would be looked upon in a different way from those who are evil doers. In tonight's two ayats that we have, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically talking about the basis and foundation of evil. Why people basically do disobedience. أفرأيت من اتخذ إلهه هواه وأضله الله على علم وختم على سمعه وقلبه وجعل على بصره غشاوة فمن يهديه من بعد الله أفلا تذكرون. The ayat basically, if we make a simple translation, would be, have you seen the one? And this is put in as a surprise. Allah says, have you seen the one who has chosen his desires as his ilah, as his Lord? He is worshipper of his own desires. وَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ عَلَى عِلْمٍ. And therefore Allah abandoned him. And I'll come to this term, why I have used the term abandon instead of saying misguided him. Since he rebelled on basis of knowledge. And so Allah sealed his ears and heart and veiled his vision. فَمَنْ يَهْدِيهِ مِنْ بَعْدِ اللَّهِ. Who is going to now guide this person after Allah has abandoned him? أَفَلَا تَذَكُّرُونَ. Do not you, reflect on this issue and take heed. Now look at this first statement. This is a very powerful ayat of Quran. Very much relevant to our own days also. أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهُهُ هَوَاهُ. The word ilah, Allah, God. And Allah is saying, have you seen the one who has taken his hawa? Hawa means, desires. Have you seen a person who has taken his own desires as his Lord? And here the issue is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that the main source of evil is when people give in to their desires. Allah says, I have given you the aql. I have given you the knowledge. of course I have also created desires and emotions in you. And this is the whole purpose of life. It's this imtihan and test that we are going through. And we have to constantly try in a way that, it is our conscious and our mind which controls the desires and not the other way around. And everything actually goes back to this problem, especially those who have ilm and knowledge and still they disobey. The root of the problem is that they are actually worshippers of their own desires. This is in a way worse than worshipping idols. Idols, okay, it is shirk. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't tolerate that. But when it comes to the issue of a person putting his own desires in place of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is the highest level of rebellion against the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is a hadith from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam where he says, "Ma ubida tahta as-sama ilahun abghadu ila Allah min al-hawa." He says that under this sky there is not a God who has been worshipped most disliked by Allah than desires. So Allah considers the hawa, the worship of desire, to be the worst kind of rebellion against Him. Many times we look at shaitan and blame him. And here I'll say he is a poor fellow. Because we have to look at the shaitan which is within. The shaitan which is outside, known as Iblis, cannot have access to us unless we give access to the shaitan. And that only happens when we give into the desires. So before blaming the shaitan outside, we have to deal with the shaitan within. And this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مِنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهُهُ هَوَاهُ. This is a concept where, a person, sometimes even not realizing, becomes a worshipper of his own desires. And therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as a response to that rebellion of that kind, Allah says, وَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ عَلَى عِلْمٍ. Now, the emphasis on the words ala ilmin is very important. Allah is using the word adalla, idlal, dhalla, dhallun, dhallin, the way we recite in Surah Al-Fatiha. This is a verb saying that Allah misguided that person. This is the literal meaning. But what does it mean actually? You will see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in many, many places, right? Even in Surah Baqarah, right? In the earlier ayat, He uses the term خَطَمَ اللَّهُ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبِهِمْ. He has put a seal on their heart. These words, putting a seal on the mind or the hearts of the people, or putting a veil on the eyes of people, or the word idlal for Allah, that He has, if you go with a literal translation, is misguided. We understand that. And that is why I have chosen the word abandon. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never does idlal until He has already given the opportunity of knowing the truth to this person. Those for whom Allah uses these terms, that He is sealing their heart and their minds, this only happens after Allah has provided the initial guidance within themselves, outside themselves, and because they chose to ignore it. It came to them again and again, but they didn't really, avail it, did not care about it. Then Allah says, okay, I have done my duty. No more, I'm not going to waste my time on you. And this is where the concept of abandoned comes in. Well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala abandons a fellow. And that is really the worst thing that can happen to a person. Here now the term is ala ilmin. Means the person who is being abandoned here, he was ala ilmin. He had the knowledge. He knew the truth. But he chose not to follow the truth. And therefore Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala abandoned him. There is actually a story narrated behind this ayat that Abu Jahl, the uncle of the Prophet, and Walid bin Mughira, one of the leaders of Quraysh, they were doing tawaf. You know, tawaf existed even in the era of Jahiliyyah. And Abu Jahl says to Walid, he says, you know, my nephew Muhammad is sadiq, he is truthful. And Walid says, don't say this loudly. You know, you are the leader of the people here, and if you say he is the truthful, then what will happen to us? He says, and if you really, he says, no, I know him. You know, I knew him as a child. I saw him growing up. I saw him as a youth. I saw him as an adult doing business. You know, and I know that he is sadiq. Then Walid bin Mughira says, then if you believe that your nephew is sadiq, why don't you follow him? And this is where Abu Jahl says, do you want me to be ridiculed by the women of Mecca that I followed my nephew? You know, it was not an issue of ignorance. It was this hawa comes in. You know, the issue that, you know, he says, I'm the uncle and he's my nephew. This goes against, you know, this sense of arrogance. And so this is where the ayat is coming. أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهُ هَوَاهُ. Have you seen the one who has taken his own desires as his Lord, as his God and Ilah? وَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ عَلَى عِلْمٍ. Allah abandoned him because he had the ilm. He knew the truth, but still chose not to follow it. The word that, and this is further explained by the second sentence, وَخَتَمَ عَلَى سَمْعِهِ وَقَلْبِهِ وَجَعَلَ عَلَى بَصَرِهِ غِشَاوَةً. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put a seal on his ears, on his heart, and he put a veil on his eyes. Now the words of putting a seal, putting a veil, not in a physical sense, these are all symbolic terms. Everything goes back to the term وَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ. Allah abandoned him. You know, these words are to be taken in the meaning of, there is a terminology in Islamic theology known as khidlan. Khidlan, this is the where the meaning of abandonment comes in. Means Allah provided the guidance because the fellow did not, you know, use it after being shown again and again the signs. Allah says, okay, that's it. I don't have to provide anything to you. And when Allah abandons a person, it becomes like there is a seal put on his heart, on his eyes, on his ears, on his mind. The opposite of khidlan, just to understand this concept more, we have the term tawfiq. You must be hearing about it. You know, we do dua for tawfiq. What is tawfiq? Tawfiq and khizlan are opposites. Tawfiq is the help of Allah. Means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala looks at a person and says, well, you know, the guidance he has been given, he is really trying hard to follow it. Although sometimes, you know, he misses the point. You know, there is weakness, but he is seriously trying to become a better person. There the tawfiq of Allah comes. You know, Allah helps that person to become better in obeying the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The opposite of tawfiq, salb tawfiq, is known as khizlan. And that is described in the Qur'an by different words, including the words idlal. So it shouldn't be taken in the literal meaning of misguidance. Allah doesn't misguide anyone. What it means is that Allah abandons and takes away the tawfiq from that person. You know, sometimes we see the money is there, you know, the time is there, we have the energy, we do everything, but at the end, it didn't work. This is where we have to realize there was no tawfiq. And that's where when we have everything, we still have to pray, Allah, give me the tawfiq to succeed in what I'm planning. And this is where we come to realize the concept of tawfiq and the role of Allah in our life. looking at this ayat, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ, have you seen a person who has chosen his own desires as his own God, and he has become worshipper of his own desires? You know, you realize that this concept is not new. Quran talks about it 1400 years ago. But there is a difference in this concept of worshiping the desires in the past and the present that we are going through now. The difference is that this existed before, but in past it was personal and individual issue. Now this whole thing has become a communal issue. You know, if there is now a collective, you know, basis for it. You know, when you look at, for example, in Europe or North America, this whole issue of even changing the definition of marriage, it boils down to this issue of أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهُهُ هَوَاهُ. In the past, it was individuals who used to do this. And this is just an example. But now you see a collective movement of getting legitimacy for what they do. You know, I'm one of the individuals, you know, authorized to sign on the marriage registration. And I remember earlier, a few years ago, before the laws were changed, the long forms, those of you who got married, you remember that long form that you had to sign? Although you didn't see what you were signing there. You'll see it said, you know, bride and groom. One column, it said groom, bride, and the other said groom. If you look at the forms which came later on, it says applicant and joint applicant. We don't know who is man and who is woman there. Even the words were changed there. And this is where we see that, you know, this concept of أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهُ هَوَاهُ, in the past it was more an individual issue, but now it has become a communal and, you know, collective issue. And so this is one of the challenges. I don't really worry about the issue of what will happen to the new next generation and their grandchildren in the West. Whether they become Christian or Jew or Hindu or Buddhist, I don't think that's the worry I would have. The worry would be that a person can say, I still want to be known as a Muslim, but I want the religion to change its laws to accommodate what I want. Where this worship of desire becomes the criteria. It's no more what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, what Rasul and the Imam is saying. It is what I want. And this is the challenge that we face. So this ayat is not just a ayat about Abu Jahl. You know, it is a challenge even for our own time. I think even the month of Ramadan, the process of fasting is actually an exercise to deal with this issue of, you know, taking our desires as our own God. You know, worshiping the desires at a lower level. You know, when we go through the process of fasting, the whole purpose is basically to deal with the strongest desires that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created within us. Means things would be halal, but when we are fasting, Allah says don't do it. Just so that we may train ourselves, you know, to control our desires, because if the desires control us, then we are going towards the path which is definitely not taking us to the tawfiq and the Jannah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Salawat. Let me connect this theme with a statement from Amir al-Mu'mineen, who is not only he's also known as Imam al-Muttaqeen. He's the leader of the righteous and the pious people. And the question that I have here is, this is part of his sayings in Nahl Balagha, saying number 281. And this is a khutbah probably, you know, uttered by him when he was now a Khalifa and the ruler of the Muslims. And he talks about somebody who passed few years before. And he uses the wordings where he says, كَانَ لِي فِي مَا مَضَى أَخٌ فِي اللَّهِ. That in the past, I had a brother in faith. أخٌ, not in my family, but فِي اللَّهِ, who was my brother in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, it's important. We call ourselves followers of Ali, Shia of Ali. That's one thing. The achievement is if Ali says, yes, you are my Shia. And this is an example. He's talking about somebody who passed away. According to the commentators of Nahj Balagha, it probably refers to either Abu Dhar or one of the other friends of Ali by the name of Usman bin Mad'un, a very pious person. Because Ali doesn't mention the name, but he describes his qualities. And he said, I had a brother in faith. And he says, the earlier statements are where he says that he was a great person in my eyes because the whole world was insignificant in his eyes. Because in his eyes, dunya was nothing. And therefore, he was a great person in my eyes. And then he describes, his characteristics. And one of the qualities he describes is relevant to this ayat. He says, وَكَانَ إِذَا بَدَأُهُ أَمْرًا. You see, when we know, and if the issues are black and white, okay, this is allowed, this is not allowed, it's clear. There's no issue of, being confused. I think the challenge is more in the larger gray area. And that middle area is a bigger one. Instead of the white and black in small areas at the end, we have a bigger, gray area in between. And that's where the challenges start. And so Amir al-Mu'minin says, وَكَانَ إِذَا بَدَأُوا أَمْرًا. When two issues came in front of him, he didn't know, should I do this way or do it the other way? Because it was not black and white. It was not that clear. What would he do? Ali says, نَظَرَ أَيُّهُمَا أَقْرَبُ إِلَى الْحَوَىٰ فَخَالِفُهُ. When he's not sure about something, but he doesn't know, should he do it or he should not do it? Is it right or wrong? He says, then he will take that issue into his heart and see whether which option is closer to his heart and his desire. Once he identifies that, he goes the opposite way. Because to oppose the desires is actually a sure way towards salvation. And this is what comes from this ayat, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهُهُ هَوَىٰ. We have to conquer and overcome our desires, and we should not become slaves of our own desires. And so, I would like to end this statement here with a question. Are we truly the Shias of Ali? Because I'll, urge you to go to saying number 281 in Nahj Balagha and look at the entire description. Because Ali at the end says, these are the qualities for which each one of you must strive. And if you cannot build these qualities in your own character fully, at least try some of them. And so Amir al-Mu'minin is presenting this person and his qualities as a role model for those whom he would consider to be his true followers and his brethren in faith. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiqat, and may He keep us on the path of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad salawatullah alayhim ajma'een. We have about 5 minutes to fasting. I don't want you to worry about food, so we'll go with some questions. You have the answer already? Smoking in the state of fasting. The reason why I'm putting this is we talked about the issue of puffers used by, those who have asthma, for example. And we said according to the fatwa these days, it doesn't harm the fast because it goes mostly in the lungs and not in the food passage. And so a person who is with asthma can still fast even if they use puffers. So somebody said, what about smoking? And so this is the question. Smoking in the state of fasting is, what is your answer? It is haram. C. Is that right? I didn't hear a clear yes there. Or is it just makruh? It is haram. And the reason is that the issue of puffer was, number one, there was a medical reason. And when it comes to the issue of smoke, inhaling smoke, we have specific hadith about it. So in the list of things which makes the fasting batil, you will see inhaling smoke. And so smoking would be specifically forbidden in the state of fasting. What about, I'm not going to leave you here on this issue. What about out if you're not fasting? If smoking is okay. There's difference in the fatwa these days. Gradually, there was a time, since there is no ayat or hadith about it, the mujtahideen in the past used to say this is jaiz. It's up to you. But gradually now that the medical science is coming to the level where they are now saying that this is really harmful for the health of a person, there are two views. People like Ayatollah Sistani leave it to the individuals. That if you are convinced by the medical report, and if your doctors, for example, say that this is definitely harmful for you, you should not smoke, then you have to follow that. So he's leaving it to the individuals. But there are others like Ayatollah Nasir Makarim Shirazi, who had the same view as Al-Sistani, until he had a meeting with the medical community in Tehran, and they gave him all the study and reports about what are the harms of smoking. So he changed the view, and he said, as far as his followers are concerned, it is haram. He doesn't give that option to his followers. And so you shouldn't be surprised if gradually the Maraji, the more convinced they become of the harm of this process, the fatwa would change. And that is actually based on this general ruling that whatever is definitely known to be harmful to a person to the extent that is going to shorten their lifespan would become haram. So using that general principle, they would apply that on smoking. And by the way, the rulings for smoking and shisha is same. Okay? Number two, on which of these 3 days is fasting recommended? Eid al-Fitr, Eid al-Ghadir, or Eid al-Adha? Are you sure about it? What about Eid al-Fitr? On Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, it is haram. It's not an issue of recommended. It is actually haram to fast on those 2 days of Eid. The only one which is recommended is Eid al-Ghadir. Is it permissible for a cook to test the food? I use the word cook and not a lady because we don't know these days who is cooking. Now testing doesn't mean swallowing, just putting it in the mouth and spitting it out. In the Shia fiqh, the fast ends at, what is the difference between sunset and Maghrib? The ayat of Quran says, وَأَتِمُّ الصِّيَامِ إِلَى اللَّيْلِ, that complete your fast إِلَى اللَّيْلِ, not إِلَى الْغُرُوب. إِلَى اللَّيْلِ means till the night comes in. And the night comes in, according to the fiqh definition, when the twilight on the eastern horizon disappears. So the sun is setting on the western horizon, although the upper limb has gone down, but there's still twilight on the opposite side. When that disappears, That's when the night starts, according to our fiqh point of view, and that's the beginning for namaz and the end for roza. So yes, normally it's 12 to 15 minutes after sunset. Which of these three is makruh in the state of fasting? Smoking, we know. It's out. Blood test or gargling. Which one would be makruh? Gargling before in wuzu, for example. Would it be makruh? In wuzu, it wouldn't be makruh. But yes, if you feel thirsty, you know you can't drink, and so you just gargling. Making sure the water doesn't go, well, it doesn't make the roza batil, but it is makruh to do that. Even in blood test, we talked about it. There's no problem when you are in the state of fasting. However, there is one issue that if you know that by giving blood, you are going to feel the weakness, then it becomes makruh, but it's not haram. Okay? So inshallah, we'll continue this tomorrow. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.